In the winter of 1834, in a quiet Virginia town where church bells marked the hours and neighbors trusted one another without question, something was breathing beneath the floorboards of a white farmhouse at the edge of town. For years, no one dared to ask what the faint cries were, until the day the basement door was forced open and 47 children were found chained in the dark. Ashbrook, Virginia was the kind of town where secrets did not survive long. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they believed they did. The Sullivan family had lived at the edge of town for nearly a decade. Edward Sullivan was a tall, rigid man with hollow cheeks and eyes that rarely blinked. He spoke softly in church, quoted scripture often, and donated generously when eyes were watching. His wife, Margaret, was quieter, thin, pale, always dressed in black, her expression unreadable. Their home stood alone beyond the tree line, a two-story white farmhouse with dark shutters and a wide porch that faced the dirt road. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. The rumors began as whispers. Children in town claimed they heard crying when they walked past the property at dusk. Farmers passing late at night said they heard metal clanging, like chains dragged slowly across stone. But in 1834, fear traveled slower than faith, and faith shielded suspicion. Then the disappearances began. First, it was Samuel Turner, a 9-year-old boy from a struggling family. He vanished while delivering eggs into town. No struggle, no blood, no footprints. Then 2 months later, Abigail Moore, an orphan who slept behind the church, disappeared without a trace. The town searched the woods, they searched the riverbanks, they searched abandoned barns. Edward Sullivan searched with them. He carried lanterns, he prayed loudly, he placed a comforting hand on grieving shoulders. And no one questioned him. Until Deputy Thomas Reed arrived in Ashbrook. Thomas was not born there. He had served in Richmond before taking the quiet post in Ashbrook. He believed in patterns, and he believed evil rarely looked like a monster. It looked ordinary. He noticed something strange. Each time a child vanished, Edward Sullivan seemed composed, not heartbroken, not shaken, just calm. Too calm. Thomas also noticed something else. Behind the Sullivan farmhouse, near the cellar doors built into the ground, the soil always looked freshly disturbed. One cold November night, Thomas rode out alone. The moon hung thin and sharp above the fields. The air was heavy with frost. He tied his horse behind the tree line and approached quietly on foot. And then he heard it. A sound, soft, faint, a child's cry. He froze. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from beneath it. Thomas moved closer, crouching near the cellar doors. A lantern flickered through the cracks. Shadows moved inside. Then he saw Margaret Sullivan. She stepped down into the cellar, carrying a small bucket. The door creaked open wider, and from below, a metallic rattle and a whisper. "Please." Thomas's blood ran cold. The next morning he returned with a warrant. The townspeople were furious. "You dare accuse the Sullivans?" one man shouted. "They are God-fearing people." Edward Sullivan stood tall as the deputy approached, his expression unchanged. "If you must search, then search." The cellar doors were locked. Thomas ordered them broken open. The wood splintered under the force of iron tools. The doors flew wide, releasing a stench so thick and rotten that several men staggered backward. Darkness swallowed the stairs. Lanterns were lit. They descended slowly, step by step. The air grew heavier, and then, eyes. Dozens of them, reflecting the lantern light from the corners of the stone basement. Children, thin, pale, chained to iron rings embedded in the walls, some too weak to stand, some clutching one another, some staring without blinking, as if fear had drained even their tears. A little girl no older than 6 reached out a trembling hand. "Are we going home?" she whispered. One by one, the chains were counted. 47. 47 children. The town of Ashbrook had been searching forests and rivers while the missing were rotting beneath their feet. Above ground, Margaret Sullivan did not scream. She did not cry. She simply sat on the porch, waiting. Edward Sullivan was brought outside in iron cuffs, and as the townspeople shouted in horror and disbelief, he looked over them calmly and said only one thing: "You do not understand what I was building." The words silenced the crowd. Building what? A prison? A cult? A punishment? Or something far worse? And in that moment, as the children were carried into the daylight, Ashbrook realized something terrifying. The nightmare had not just been hidden beneath the house, it had been hiding in plain sight. If you're ready, I'll continue with. And each missing child had last been seen near the South Road, the same road that curved past the Sullivan farmhouse before disappearing into the woods. At first, it seemed like coincidence. The South Road was commonly used by farmers and merchants. But when Thomas Reed mapped the disappearances on paper, a pattern emerged that he could no longer ignore. Every path led back to the same stretch of land, the same quiet house with white wooden siding and dark shuttered windows that never seemed fully open. After the cellar doors were broken and the 47 children were pulled into the daylight, the town fell into chaos. Mothers screamed as they searched faces for their own sons and daughters. Some children collapsed in the snow, too weak to stand after months underground. Others shielded their eyes from the sunlight as if it burned. The chains that had bound them were thick iron, bolted into stone walls with deliberate precision. This had not been madness born overnight. This had been engineered. Edward Sullivan stood silently as iron cuffs were fastened around his wrists. His expression did not crack. He did not plead. He did not resist. When Thomas demanded to know why, Edward's answer was calm, almost instructional. "The world is corrupt," he said quietly. "I was preserving what could still be shaped." Those words spread through Ashbrook faster than the winter wind. Margaret Sullivan was arrested as well, though she appeared distant, as if the noise around her was happening underwater. She neither defended herself nor denied the accusations. When asked how long the children had been down there, she whispered only one sentence: "Long enough to forget their names." Inside the cellar, investigators began documenting what they found. Small straw beds lined the walls, buckets of water, shelves stacked with preserved food. A blackboard hung at the far end of the basement, covered in chalk writing. Verses from scripture, rewritten again and again, but altered, twisted, bent to mean something else. Next to the blackboard were lists, names, ages, notes beside some of them: obedient, resistant, promising, broken. Thomas felt a sickness rise in his chest as he read. One of the older boys, perhaps 14, refused medical attention at first. He stood near the cellar stairs, staring back into the darkness as if something still lived there. When Thomas gently asked his name, the boy hesitated before answering. "Daniel," he said, though he sounded unsure. "He said we shouldn't remember who we were before." Thomas knelt to meet his eyes. "Who said that?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Mr. Sullivan, he said we were chosen." Over the next hours, fragments of truth began surfacing from the children who could speak. Edward had told them the world above was ending, that their families had abandoned them, that Ashbrook was sinful and doomed. He claimed he was building something pure beneath the earth, a new beginning, shaped by discipline and obedience. The chains, he insisted, were protection, the darkness was safety, isolation was salvation. But there was something worse. Several children described a room behind a locked wooden partition in the far corner of the cellar. When deputies forced it open, they discovered stacks of journals, years' worth of meticulous entries written in Edward's tight, controlled handwriting. The journals detailed his experiment. He wrote about conditioning, about breaking attachment, about removing identity so loyalty could be rebuilt from nothing. He referred to the children not as victims, but as foundation stones. One entry made Thomas's hands tremble. "The town will never understand the necessity of sacrifice," he had written, "but when the time comes, they will see that I have saved what they allowed to rot." Saved from what?
As word spread across Virginia, officials from Richmond arrived to investigate. Reporters began traveling toward Ashbrook. The once sleepy town became a spectacle of horror. People who had once defended the Sullivans now avoided eye contact. The church removed Edward's donations from its records. Families questioned how they had missed the signs. But the deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the truth became. The cellar had been reinforced from the inside years ago. Receipts found in Edward's study showed he had been purchasing iron restraints long before the first child disappeared. The blacksmith in the neighboring county admitted Edward claimed he needed them for livestock control. Livestock. That word echoed in Thomas's mind. One evening, while Edward sat alone in the temporary jail cell, Thomas entered carrying one of the journals. He placed it on the table between them. "You planned this for years," Thomas said quietly. "You built a prison under your home." Edward lifted his eyes slowly. "No," he replied, "I built a sanctuary." "For children?" Thomas's voice tightened. "For the future," Edward corrected. Thomas leaned forward. "You stole them from their families." "I rescued them from weakness," Edward said without hesitation. "Parents indulge, towns decay, faith erodes. I removed them before the rot could claim them." The certainty in his voice was what frightened Thomas most. There was no rage, no madness, only belief. Meanwhile, the children were moved to temporary housing in the church hall. Doctors from Richmond examined them. Many were malnourished. Several bore scars on their wrists and ankles from the iron restraints. Some could barely speak above a whisper. Yet some defended Edward. They insisted he had protected them, that the outside world was dangerous, that returning home would bring punishment. The psychological damage ran deeper than the physical. Then came the revelation that shook Ashbrook even further. Investigators found a second excavation site beneath the barn behind the farmhouse. It was unfinished, but clearly intended to expand the cellar system. More iron rings had already been installed in stone walls, more straw beds prepared. Edward had not intended to stop at 47. On the night before he was transported to Richmond for trial, a fire broke out in the Sullivan farmhouse. Flames consumed the white wooden structure within hours. Some believed it was an accident caused by unattended lanterns during investigation. Others whispered that someone in town had taken justice into their own hands. By morning, nothing remained but blackened beams and a collapsed foundation. But the cellar, the underground chamber, still stood beneath the ashes. As weeks passed, the children slowly began reclaiming pieces of themselves. Families reunited in tears. Some children remembered their full names immediately. Others struggled. Daniel, the boy who first spoke, later confessed that Edward had told them a final prophecy. That even if he were taken away, the idea would survive, that someone else would understand his vision. Those words haunted Thomas. During the trial in Richmond, Edward Sullivan never once apologized. He described his actions as preparation, as purification, as necessary discipline in a crumbling society. Margaret remained silent throughout proceedings, staring ahead as if already detached from the world. The court sentenced Edward to life imprisonment. Margaret received a lesser sentence after evidence suggested she lived under his control, though debate continued for years over how much she truly knew. Ashbrook eventually returned to quiet routine. Crops were planted again, church bells rang again, children played in the streets again. But no one walked near the South Road after sunset. And even decades later, when wind passed through the burned foundation at the edge of town, some claimed they could still hear it, the faint metallic echo of chains shifting in the dark. Not because the cellar was still occupied, but because evil, once unearthed, never truly disappears. It simply waits for belief strong enough to justify it again.
10 years after the cellar doors were broken open, Daniel Harper still could not sleep in complete darkness. Even as a grown man of 24, living miles away from Ashbrook in a small apartment overlooking the James River, he kept a lantern burning through the night. Not because he feared shadows, but because silence reminded him too much of chains. The world knew him as one of the 47, Newspapers had given the survivors that name during the trial of Edward Sullivan. For months, reporters had followed their recovery, publishing sympathetic headlines and dramatic illustrations of the underground chamber. Donations had poured in, churches held prayer vigils, politicians promised reform. And then, slowly, the world moved on. But Daniel never did. He had been 14 when he was taken, old enough to remember his mother's face clearly, young enough to be reshaped. What disturbed him most was not the hunger or the iron restraints, it was the voice. Edward Sullivan's voice had been steady, patient, almost fatherly. He never screamed, he never rushed. He spoke of purpose, of destiny, of building something that would outlive corruption. And in the darkness of that cellar, where the outside world faded like a distant memory, belief became easier than resistance. Daniel still hated himself for how easily it had happened. After the trial, Daniel was sent to Richmond to live with distant relatives. They were kind, but cautious, as if afraid he might break without warning. Doctors called it conditioning trauma. Priests called it spiritual confusion. Daniel called it something simpler. He called it theft. Because Edward had not just stolen his freedom, he had stolen his certainty. For years, Daniel tried to live quietly. He apprenticed at a printing press, learned typesetting, and avoided any mention of Ashbrook. But the past had a way of circling back, especially when letters began arriving. The first one came in early spring. It was unsigned, no return address, only 3 words written in careful handwriting. He was right. Daniel stared at the message for hours. He told himself it was a cruel prank. The trial had been widely publicized. Anyone could have sent it. He burned the letter in his stove and tried to forget. 2 weeks later, another arrived. This world is rotting. His hands began to tremble. The third letter arrived with something else inside, a small iron ring, no larger than a bracelet, identical to those bolted into the cellar walls beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. He could not breathe. He had thought the nightmare ended with Edward's sentencing, life imprisonment, no possibility of release, locked behind stone walls hundreds of miles away. Yet someone was writing in the same measured tone, someone who believed. And belief had once built a prison under a farmhouse. Daniel traveled back to Ashbrook for the first time in a decade. The town had aged. New storefronts stood where old ones had burned. Children who had once been hidden indoors now ran freely through the streets. Yet the South Road remained mostly empty. Grass had grown tall where the Sullivan farmhouse once stood. The cellar entrance had been sealed with stone and iron by court order. A warning sign marked the land as condemned. Daniel stood at the edge of the field, staring at the ground that had swallowed years of his life. He remembered Edward's final words in the courtroom. "Ideas do not die with men." At the time, it had sounded like delusion. Now, it felt like a warning. Sheriff Thomas Reed, older, grayer, but still steady, greeted Daniel with quiet respect. They had not spoken in years, but their connection was forged in something neither could forget. When Daniel showed him the letters, Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're not the only one," the sheriff admitted. 3 other survivors had reported receiving similar messages, different handwriting styles, but identical phrases, references to decay, purification, renewal. One letter included a map, a rough sketch of rural farmland outside a neighboring county. Thomas had dismissed it as the work of an obsessed copycat, but the iron ring changed things. "That metal isn't common," Thomas said quietly. "It was custom forged." "By the blacksmith," Daniel whispered. "The same blacksmith who had supplied Edward years ago." They rode out together the next morning. The blacksmith shop stood at the edge of a creek, its chimney breathing thin gray smoke into the sky. The man who opened the door was not the same as before. The original blacksmith had died 5 years ago. His son, Elijah Morgan, now ran the forge. When confronted with the iron ring, Elijah's face drained of color. "I made that," he admitted after a long silence. "For who?" Thomas demanded. Elijah hesitated. "A group," he finally said. "Men who said they were building animal enclosures on private land. They paid well, asked no questions. I didn't think." He trailed off. Daniel felt a chill crawl through him. "How many rings?" he asked quietly. Elijah swallowed. "More than 50. Silence filled the forge, broken only by the crackle of fire. Thomas demanded the location of the farmland listed on the order slips. Elijah provided it with shaking hands. The land lay 20 miles west of Ashbrook, deeper into isolation than the Sullivan farmhouse had ever been. It belonged to a recently formed religious collective, calling themselves the Renewal Fellowship. They claimed to be restoring moral discipline in a collapsing world. Daniel's stomach turned at the name. Renewal. It was one of Edward's favorite words. As they approached the property at dusk, Daniel noticed something immediately. The land was newly cleared, but beneath the main wooden structure stood reinforced stonework, fresh, recently built. He felt it before he saw it, the shape of something below ground. Thomas signaled for backup from Richmond, but Daniel could not wait. The memory of straw beds and chalkboards flashed behind his eyes. The idea that another cellar might already hold children was unbearable. They moved toward the building cautiously. Through an open window, Daniel heard a voice, calm, measured, instructive. "We must separate them from corruption," the voice said. "Identity is weakness. Strength is obedience." Daniel froze. It was not Edward Sullivan's voice, but it carried the same certainty, the same poison wrapped in patience. Thomas drew his weapon. Daniel felt the lantern-lit darkness of his childhood rising again around him, but this time he was not 14. This time he was not chained. This time he would not be silent, because Edward had been right about one thing. Ideas do not die with men. They evolve. And if no one stands against them, they build new cellars in new towns, under new names. As night fell over the farmland, Daniel stepped forward, ready to descend once more into the dark, not as a prisoner, but as the one who would end what had begun beneath a farmhouse 10 years ago.
The night after the underground chamber investigation, Daniel could not sleep. The image of empty stone walls and the wooden chair kept replaying inside his mind. Psychological conditioning was far more terrifying than physical chains. Edward Sullivan had believed that isolation could reshape identity itself. Outside Daniel's apartment window, the James River reflected faint moonlight. He was holding another letter. This one was different. Inside the envelope was a small map, not detailed, just rough lines. 3 marks were drawn near the western farmland outside Ashbrook. Thomas Reed called Daniel late that night. "I think someone is watching the survivors," Thomas said quietly. Daniel did not answer immediately. "Why do you think that?" he asked. "Because 2 of the rescued children received toys in anonymous packages." Daniel's chest tightened. "What kind of toys?" Thomas hesitated. "Wooden dolls." Silence filled the line. Daniel remembered something from the cellar journals. Edward had written about replacing fear with familiarity. Sometimes he gave children objects to hold during isolation, objects that became emotional anchors. "Where are the packages now?" Daniel asked. "Burned," Thomas replied, "but I think someone is continuing the network." Daniel stared at the map inside the letter. The 3 marks looked intentional, like someone wanted him to go there, not as a threat, but as a message. The next morning, Daniel traveled alone toward the western farmland. The area was mostly abandoned agricultural land owned by several small private groups. The first location on the map was an old abandoned storage barn. The wooden structure was partly collapsed. Inside, Daniel found nothing at first: dust, broken wood, old farming tools. Then he noticed something: fresh footprints, not old ones, recent. He followed them carefully toward the back wall of the barn. There he found another small wooden box hidden beneath broken floorboards. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a group of people standing near a river, and in the background, a stone building that looked similar to the Sullivan cellar structure. On the back of the photograph was written, "The work continues." Daniel felt cold fear spread slowly through his body, because Edward Sullivan was still in prison, and yet someone was continuing his philosophy. Daniel knew then that this was not the end. The network had survived, not through force, but through belief. and belief was harder to destroy than chains. He placed the photograph inside his jacket and returned to Ashbrook. That night, Daniel called Thomas. "We need federal intelligence support," Daniel said quietly. Thomas asked, "Why?" Daniel answered slowly, "Because this is bigger than one town. Someone is rebuilding the idea." The wind moved outside Daniel's apartment window, and far away, somewhere hidden in rural darkness, people were gathering quietly, learning, watching, waiting.
The western farmland outside Ashbrook was silent during the daytime, but at night it carried a strange feeling of observation. Daniel Harper stood near the old abandoned river storage area where the photograph had been found. The wind moved slowly through dry grass fields, carrying the faint smell of soil and distant water. Thomas Reed arrived just after sunset. "You shouldn't be here alone," the sheriff said. Daniel did not answer immediately. He was studying the landscape. "Do you feel it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Feel what?" "Like someone is watching this land." Thomas sighed. "We arrested the main network." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That was only the structure we saw." Thomas understood what he meant. Ideas were harder to arrest than people. They walked toward the small abandoned river building marked on the map inside the letter Daniel had received. The building was older than the Sullivan farmhouse. Wooden walls were darkened by age. Windows were broken. Inside, dust covered everything except one table placed deliberately in the center. On the table lay 3 wooden objects, not toys, symbols. Daniel picked one up carefully. It was a small carved bird. Thomas spoke quietly. "This is not criminal activity alone." Daniel nodded. "This is philosophy." Silence filled the room. Then Thomas said something disturbing. "We received information from federal surveillance units." Daniel turned slowly. "What did they find?" "There are small private groups meeting across 3 states. Same language?" "Yes." "About discipline?" "Yes." "About saving children from modern society?" "Yes." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The philosophy was spreading again, not as an organization, but as a belief. Outside, the wind suddenly increased. The old wooden door of the building moved slightly, though no one touched it. Thomas drew his weapon. "Did you lock it?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said quietly. A low sound came from the far corner of the room, like something dragging slowly. Thomas turned the lantern. Nothing was there. But Daniel noticed something else. Fresh scratches near the floorboards. Someone had been inside recently, not long ago. They searched beneath the wooden table. Inside they found folded papers, handwritten notes. "The world teaches children chaos. Freedom without structure creates suffering. The future requires guidance." Daniel read the lines slowly. The handwriting was calm, controlled, like Edward Sullivan's journals. Thomas whispered, "It's the same thinking." "Yes," Daniel said, "but not the same person." That realization was more frightening, because ideas were continuing without Edward. They left the building after documenting evidence. As they walked back toward the car, Daniel suddenly stopped. "What is it?" Thomas asked. Daniel did not speak immediately. He was listening. Far away, across the farmland, he thought he heard something. Not noise, not wind. Something like a group of people speaking quietly in the night. Thomas said, "We should move." But Daniel stayed still for a few seconds longer, because he knew something important. Networks could be destroyed, but belief systems survived inside human desire for safety. Many people were afraid of modern freedom, afraid of uncertainty, afraid of raising children in chaos, and that fear could be used, even without violence. Back in Ashbrook, Daniel visited the church hall where the rescued children were living temporarily. Aaron, the boy who had spoken about hidden walls, approached him quietly. "Do you think they are still out there?" Aaron asked. Daniel knelt beside him. "Yes." "Will they come back?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. "They may try." Aaron looked down. "Why do people want to control children?" Daniel placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Because children represent the future," Daniel said. "And some people are afraid of the future if they cannot shape it."
Aaron was silent. Then he asked something very quietly. "Are we safe?" Daniel did not lie. Not completely. But he added something stronger. "But we are stronger than before." That night, Daniel received another letter. No envelope, just paper slipped under his apartment door. Inside was written only one sentence: "You are beginning to understand." Daniel did not burn this letter. He kept it, because now he knew something important. This was not about fear. This was about control disguised as protection. And somewhere in western farmland darkness, people were gathering quietly, believing they were saving the world.
The letter arrived again 3 days later. This time, Daniel found it inside the church hall where the rescued children were staying. The paper was folded carefully, without envelope, without signature. Inside was written, "Come to the northern forest tonight." Daniel did not show the letter to anyone, not even Sheriff Thomas Reed. That night, the moon was thin and cold, hidden partially behind dark, moving clouds. Daniel drove alone toward the northern forest outside Ashbrook. The road became narrower as he moved deeper into isolation. At the edge of the forest, he parked his car and continued walking. The air inside the forest felt heavier, older, like it carried memories. At exactly midnight, he reached a small clearing marked by 3 tall pine trees. Someone was already there. 5 people stood in the darkness, 2 women, 3 men. They did not move when Daniel approached. "You came alone," one man said. "Yes," Daniel replied. The man stepped forward slightly. "My name is Jonathan Hale." Daniel did not react. "I know what you represent," Jonathan continued quietly. "You represent resistance." Daniel asked slowly, "What do you want?" Jonathan spoke calmly. "We are not criminals." Silence followed. Then he added, "We are protectors." Daniel felt a cold sensation move slowly inside his chest. "Protectors of what?" Daniel asked. "Children," Jonathan replied. Daniel's voice became sharper. "By imprisoning them underground?" Jonathan shook his head. "You misunderstand." "No," Daniel said quietly. "I understand too well." The woman standing behind Jonathan spoke next. "Modern society exposes children to violence, confusion, and moral decay." Daniel answered immediately. "Freedom is not decay." She replied softly. "Freedom without guidance becomes chaos." Thomas Reed's words from earlier echoed in Daniel's mind. This was not criminal thinking alone. This was ideology. Jonathan continued speaking. "Edward Sullivan was impatient. He used physical chains. We are improving the method." "How?" Daniel asked. "Education, isolation, emotional protection." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You are repeating the same philosophy." "No," Jonathan said. "We are removing violence." Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "But you are removing choice." Silence filled the forest. Wind moved through pine branches slowly. Jonathan spoke again. "The world is becoming unstable. Technology destroys attention. Social influence corrupts innocence. Parents are losing control." Daniel replied quietly. "So you believe children must be separated from society?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "For their safety." Daniel asked one final question. "If your system is correct, why hide in forests?" Jonathan did not answer immediately, because the truth was uncomfortable. People who believed they were saving the world sometimes knew the world would not agree. After several seconds, Jonathan spoke. "We do not want conflict." "Then stop trying to control children," Daniel said. One of the men behind Jonathan spoke angrily. "You do not understand what is coming." "What is coming?" Daniel asked calmly. The man answered. "Collapse,
Morality collapse, family collapse, civilization collapse. Daniel stood silently. Then he said something very slowly. Fear builds prisons faster than iron. No one spoke for almost a minute. Then Jonathan spoke quietly. You are dangerous to our future. And you are dangerous to freedom, Daniel replied. Jonathan raised his hand slightly, not as a threat, as a warning. This conversation ends here. Daniel turned and began walking back into the forest. No one followed him, because this meeting was not about violence. It was about understanding that two different beliefs were fighting for the future. Back in Ashbrook, Daniel called Sheriff Thomas. We found them, Daniel said. Thomas asked, Arrest? Daniel answered slowly. No. Why? Because this is not a criminal network alone. Thomas understood immediately. This is ideology. Yes. The wind outside Daniel's apartment window moved slowly that night. And far inside the northern forests, people continued gathering quietly, believing they were protecting humanity, believing control was salvation, believing fear could build a better future. But history had already shown something else. Ideas born in darkness rarely stayed controlled. They grew, like roots beneath forgotten soil.
Winter came early to Ashbrook that year. Snow covered the farmland roads, and the burned foundation of the old Sullivan farmhouse stood silently beneath white frost. Daniel Harper knew something was coming. He could feel it in the way letters stopped arriving. No anonymous messages, no maps, no warnings. Silence was never peace. Silence was preparation. Sheriff Thomas Reed visited Daniel late one evening. We have intelligence reports, Thomas said quietly. What kind? Daniel asked. Multiple small groups are meeting again. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. How many states? 4 confirmed. Daniel did not speak immediately. The philosophy was spreading, not through organization, through belief. People were joining because they were afraid of modern uncertainty, afraid of raising children in a world of social media pressure, violence news, and economic instability. Fear was becoming fertile ground. Thomas continued. We intercepted one conversation recording. What did they say? Daniel asked. Thomas hesitated. They are planning something they call the gathering. Daniel's stomach tightened. When? Next month. Where? Thomas handed him a map. 3 locations were marked. All were rural isolation zones. Daniel studied the map carefully. Then he spoke quietly. They are trying to build parallel communities. Yes, Thomas said, like Edward's vision. Daniel felt a cold weight inside his chest, because this was bigger than he expected. That night, Daniel visited the church hall where the rescued children lived. Aaron was sitting alone near a window, watching snow fall slowly outside. Are you leaving again? Aaron asked quietly. Yes, Daniel replied. Will you come back? Daniel sat beside him. I will try. Aaron asked one more question. Why do they want control so much? Daniel thought carefully before answering. Because uncertainty is frightening, he said, and some people believe safety requires control. Aaron stayed silent. Then he said something very softly. I don't want to live in a world where someone decides my thoughts. Daniel felt emotion tighten inside his throat. You won't, he said, but he knew promises were fragile, because history repeated itself when fear became stronger than reason. The following week, Daniel traveled with Thomas and federal agents toward the first gathering location. It was a rural mountain valley surrounded by tall, rocky hills. From a distance, Daniel saw wooden houses built in a circular pattern, like a closed community. Not prison, but isolation. They waited until night, then approached quietly. Inside one of the buildings, people were sitting in silence, not chained, not forced, but listening to a man speaking calmly at the front.
Daniel recognized the speech pattern immediately. It was similar to Edward Sullivan's philosophy. The man spoke about protecting children from chaotic influence, about guiding morality, about rebuilding society's moral foundation. Thomas whispered, "Do we arrest them?" Daniel shook his head slightly. Not yet, because he wanted to understand how belief was spreading. Suddenly, the speaker stopped and looked directly toward the door, as if he knew someone was watching. "Visitors are welcome," the man said calmly. Daniel stepped forward slowly. "I am Daniel Harper." The man nodded. "I know. My name is Michael Grant." Silence filled the hall. Michael continued speaking. "We are not criminals. You are building isolated communities," Daniel said, "for protection." "Yes. From what?" Michael answered slowly. "From the collapse of society." Daniel spoke quietly. "You are removing choice." Michael replied, "We are reducing suffering." Daniel asked one final question. "If your system is correct, why do you need secrecy?" Michael did not answer, because truth was uncomfortable. Suddenly, Thomas received a radio message. Second location showing movement. Daniel understood immediately. The gathering was not one place, it was multiple, a network of belief. As they left the valley, snow began falling again. Thomas said quietly, "What now?" Daniel looked toward the distant dark forest. "We stop the idea," he said, "not the people, the idea." Because he had learned something from history. Chains could be broken, but belief required understanding. And the real battle was not between people, it was between fear and freedom. The night of the gathering arrived 3 weeks later. Snow covered the mountain valley where the second community had been observed. Federal agents, Sheriff Thomas Reed, and Daniel Harper waited outside the isolation settlement. Inside the wooden circular hall, people were still sitting quietly, listening to calm speeches about protection, discipline, and safety. Daniel knew this moment would decide more than one town. It would decide whether fear or freedom would shape the future. Thomas spoke quietly beside him. "If we move now, there could be conflict." Daniel nodded. "I know. Then why are we here?" Daniel looked toward the wooden hall. Because ideas must be challenged, not only arrested. He walked forward alone. Inside the hall, Michael Grant was speaking. "Freedom without structure creates suffering," Michael said calmly. "Children need protection from chaos." Daniel stepped inside slowly. Everyone turned to look at him. Silence filled the hall. Michael spoke first. "You came again." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Why?" "To ask one question." Michael nodded slowly. "Ask." Daniel's voice was quiet but powerful. "If your system is correct, why are children afraid inside it?" Silence followed. No one spoke, because Daniel had asked the most dangerous question. Truth was not measured by philosophy, it was measured by emotion. A small girl sitting near the front looked at Daniel. Her eyes were tired, not angry, not happy, just tired. She whispered something barely audible. "I want to choose my future." The words spread like wind. Another child repeated quietly, "I want to go home." Michael closed his eyes slowly. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Because belief systems collapse when followers begin questioning safety. Daniel spoke again. "Protection without choice is imprisonment. Fear is not civilization. Love cannot grow in controlled darkness." Outside, Thomas Reed signaled federal agents to stay ready. No weapons were raised, because this was not a war of guns, this was a war of ideas. Finally, Michael spoke. "What do you want?" Daniel answered calmly. "Let them leave if they want." Silence filled the hall. 1 minute passed, then another. Slowly, children began standing. First one, then another, then more. No one stopped them. Some adults watched silently, some cried quietly. Because belief was not broken by force, it was broken by doubt. The girl who spoke earlier walked toward Daniel. "Can I go home?" she asked. Yes, Daniel said gently. Federal teams opened the exit doors. Children walked outside into snowy night air. Freedom felt cold, but real. Michael remained standing inside the hall. After everyone left, only Daniel and Michael were there. Michael spoke quietly. "You didn't destroy us." "No," Daniel said, "because destruction does not stop ideas." Michael asked one last question. "What stops them?" Daniel answered slowly. "Truth chosen freely." Michael nodded, then said something unexpected. "You are right." 3 days later, the gathering community dissolved peacefully. Some members returned to normal society. Some continued their beliefs privately, but the network stopped expanding. Ashbrook returned to quiet life. The rescued children began school programs and therapy recovery. Daniel visited them often. Aaron grew older. One evening, Aaron asked Daniel, "Is the world safe now?" Daniel smiled softly. "No world is ever completely safe." "Then why fight?" Aaron asked. Daniel looked toward the river. "Because freedom is not the absence of fear. It is the courage to live despite it." Years later, people remembered the story of the cellar, the underground children, and the father-like man who fought ideas instead of people. Some called Daniel a hero. Some called him dangerous. But Daniel never cared about labels. One winter evening, Daniel stood alone near the old Sullivan farmland. Snow fell slowly. The burned foundation was silent. Wind moved across empty soil. And somewhere far away, people were still choosing what to believe. Because history never truly ends. It only changes the names of its fears.